Hi dear students, welcome to the session. You know that nationalism is a spiritual bond which brings persons having unity of language, race, religion, history and customs together. In India, the foundation of the national movement was laid in the 19th century. It was the process of nation making which brought together different sections of people like the peasants, the middle class, the working class, the artisans and the intelligentsia against the British colonialism. Indian National Congress, which was founded in 1885, was one of the premier organizations associated with the national movement. It was the first organized expression of Indian nationalism. When we analyze the history of the national movement from 1885 to 1947, we can see that three important phases dominated the national movement. They are the moderate phase, the extremist phase, and the Gandhian phase. The moderate phase was between the period 1885 to 1905. The extremist phase between 1905 to 1920 and the Gandhian phase from 1920 to 1947. Today in this class, I will tell you about the moderate phase of the nationalist movement. Who were the moderates? The moderates were the early congressmen who dominated the affairs of the International Congress from 1885 to 1905. They were called so because they were moderate in politics and they were staunch believers of liberalism. The main political activity of the moderates can be summed up as constitutional agitation. Constitutional agitation, that is, they wanted to work within the four walls of the law. And it is believed that they did not believe in active response policy. They followed a policy of prayer, petition, and protest, and this method has been called the 3 P's of the moderates. When we look into the early nationalist movement, we can cite a number of examples for early nationalist leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji, Surendranath Banerjee, W.C. Banerjee, etc. were some of the examples for early nationalist leaders. These early nationalist leaders believed that a direct struggle for the political emancipation of the country has not yet arrived. They realized the need to bring a large number of Indian people into the vortex of nationalism. They also realized the need to spread the feeling of nationalism among the people. They were fully aware of the fact that India had just entered the process of becoming a nation. They wanted to give people training in politics and political agitation. One thing remembered is that the early nationalists believed that the British wanted to be just to the Indians. But the British were not aware of the real conditions of India. Therefore, public opinion could be created in the country and presented to the government in the form of meetings, memorials, resolutions, etc. The nationalists hoped that by doing this, the British would concede their demands gradually. Thus, the nationalists wanted to unite and educate the people on important political questions. And also they wanted to persuade the British government and the British public opinion to introduce reforms in India. For this purpose, they established a British Committee of International Congress in London, and in 1890 they started a journal called India to popularize their ideology among the British people. The early nationalists demanded a number of grievances before the British government. When we analyze the resolutions of the Congress at its early sessions, we can see that the grievances were centered around four aspects: economic, constitutional, administrative, and defense of civil rights. Now, we can look into what are the economic demands put forwarded by these nationalists before the British government. Perhaps the most important political activity of the early nationalists was the economic critique of British imperialism. Leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji and R.C. Dutt carefully analyzed the political economy of British imperialism in India. We know the work of Naoroji, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. In this book, he put forward the drain theory, and he exposed the exploitative nature of British rule in India. These early nationalists analyzed the transformation of the self-sufficient Indian economy into a colonial economy under the British rule. They criticized India for just becoming a mere exporter of raw materials and foodstuffs to Britain, an importer of manufactured goods from Britain, and also a field of investment for British capital. They criticized the economic policies of the British were responsible for the poverty in India. They criticized that the high land revenue policies of the British led to the impoverishment of the peasants, and the high taxation system were also criticized by the nationalists. They criticized that the economic backwardness and underdevelopment of India was due to the indiscriminative policy of the Britain. This was the condition of India, the economic condition of India, and the nationalists demanded certain reforms in this area. They demanded the reduction of land revenue. They also demanded that the government should make efforts to free the peasants from the clutches of the money lenders. They also asked the government to better the condition of laborers in the plantation sector, and also to abolish the laws like salt tax. They also asked the government to make inquiries into India's growing poverty, to put an end to unfair excise duties and tariffs. They also asked the government for the development of agricultural banks and to make more investment on welfare activities like health, sanitation, etc. When we look into the economic demands of the nationalists, we can see that they were more rational in nature. Then coming into the constitutional demands of the moderates. Constitutional demands of the moderates. We should note that the legislative councils in India had no real power till 1920. When we analyze the history of Imperial Legislative Council from 1862 to 1892, we can see that only 45 Indians were nominated to Imperial Legislative Council. Thus, the constitutional demands of the moderates were expansion of councils, that is, giving more representation to the Indians in councils. They also demanded reform of councils, that is, giving more power to councils, especially over finances. They also demanded control over budget. Control over budget, that is, the right to vote upon and amend the budget. It is also to be noted that during this phase, the nationalists raised the slogan, "No taxation without representation," as like in the American colonies. No taxation without representation. And towards the beginning of the 20th century, we can see that the constitutional demands of the moderates widened, as in 1904, Navroji, and in 1905, Gokhale demanded self-rule within the British Empire. Self-rule within the British Empire. This is a very important aspect to be noted. While we analyze the constitutional demands of the moderates, we can see that they were less democratic in nature. They were less democratic in nature. Also, the moderates failed to demand for the right to vote for the masses and for the women. Because of the continuous demands from the moderates, the government of India was forced to pass the Indian Councils Act of 1892. Indian Councils Act of 1892. The Act increased the number of Indians in the provincial and imperial legislative councils, but the officials remained majority. The Act was a total disappointment for the moderates, and they called the Act as a hoax. This is what about the constitutional demands of the moderates and the official response towards these demands. Then administrative demands of the moderates. The moderates criticized the corrupted administrative system of the government. So they asked the government to make reforms in the sector. They asked the government for the Indianization of higher grades of administrative services. The moderates thus hoped that this would make Indian administration more responsive to Indian needs and it make Indian administration less cost. And also they asked the government the separation of judiciary from executive. The moderates hoped that by separating judiciary from executive, the people might get some protection. They also criticized the aggressive foreign policy of the government against India's neighbors. They criticized the annexation policy carried out by the British in Burma and attack upon Afghanistan. They also criticized the government for the suppression of tribals in northwestern India. The nationalists also demanded to the government for the spread of primary education among the masses. Also, they asked the government to make facilities for technical and higher education. The moderates also asked the government to make improvement in the conditions of Indian workers abroad, especially in other British colonies, who are facing racial discrimination and oppression there. So, facilities should be made to improve the conditions of Indian laborers abroad. These were some of the administrative demands put forward by the nationalists. Then coming into the demands related to defense of civil rights. The early nationalists demanded the right to speech, thought, association, and a free press. These demands of the moderates got wide popularity during the freedom struggle in later years. These demands of the moderates had its impact upon the people. This is evident from an incident. In 1897, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, along with his associates, arrested for spreading disaffection against the British government. They were put to long years of imprisonment, and the whole country protested against this arrest of Tilak. And it was after this incident that Tilak became a dominant figure in Indian politics. And these were some of the aspects related with the demands of the Congress in its early phase. Then we can evaluate what was the official attitude towards the Congress. We know that the Indian National Congress was established with the blessings of the British officials. But we can see after 1887, the official attitude towards the Congress changed. They became suspicious of the national movement. They asked the nationalist leaders to divert more on social issues rather than on political affairs. And when the Congress refused to do their demands, the officials began to criticize the Congress openly and bitterly. Lord Dufferin, the then Viceroy, called the Congress as representing only a microscopic minority of people. The officials branded the nationalist leaders as seditious Brahmins, disloyal Babus, and violent villains. Lord Curzon in 1900 wrote to the Secretary of State that Congress is tottering to its fall, and one of my great ambitions while in India is to assist it to a peaceful demise. We can see that the officials followed a policy of divide and rule, and they encouraged the reactionary elements in the country. They asked Sir Syed Ahmad Khan to form an anti-Congress movement. They also tried to divide Hindus and Muslims. Thus, we can see that at the one hand, they are giving minor concessions to the Congress, and on the other hand, they tried to suppress the nationalist movement. But we can see that the British were failed to check the rising tide of nationalism. Before conclusion, we have to evaluate the works of the early nationalists. There are so many criticisms against the moderates. The critic says that the early nationalists did not achieve much success. Very few reforms asked by them were passed by the British government. They also criticized for giving passive role to masses in the early phase of the nationalist movement. Their method of action is criticized as an act of political mendicancy. But in spite of all these limitations, we should note that it was the early nationalists who laid the foundation of internationalism in India. They propagated among the people the ideas of civil liberty, nationalism, secularism, democracy, etc. The economic critique of the early nationalists was very important, and it served as a guiding factor for the nationalist struggle in the later years. To conclude, we can say that the early nationalist leaders deserve a high place among the makers of modern India. Thank you.